Laptops get dropped, lost, stolen, or simply fall at the worst possible times. Technology has a habit of working well until it doesn't. There's a bigger issue. Most IT systems used by construction companies were designed for office workers, not field operations. So they rely on software installed on individual machines, files stored locally on aging servers, VPN connections that slow everything down, and security that depends on the physical device. That model breaks down fast in construction. So today we're talking about what modern construction IT should actually look like, especially when it comes to secure cloud environments and virtual desktops. John works directly with construction firms that need field-ready systems, stronger cybersecurity, infrastructure that scales without increasing risk. John, why do traditional on-premise setups struggle in construction environments?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. There's two significant reasons. There's more, but the two main ones are, to run these database applications that construction companies rely on, it requires heavy infrastructure. And that heavy infrastructure translates into, heavy CapEx for hardware and software. It translates into heavy support and it translates into much higher need for cybersecurity diligence and hardening. So that's one reason, and the second reason is mobility. You touched on it here just shortly ago. These folks aren't all office workers. In fact, in many cases, the higher percentage of our field personnel versus in office, and so they have to access this infrastructure remotely. So now that just adds complexity to your security posture. It adds complexity to your connectivity needs. And again, certainly that back end infrastructure. We've had very recently a customer who fell right into this bucket with multiple servers improperly set up, for the office workers, even, a lot of security holes created so that the field personnel could get to this infrastructure. And we're in the process now of unwinding them from that and getting them into the cloud.
Does that explain the difference between just moving files to the cloud and developing a true virtual desktop environment? We always get pushback in the years working with you about, oh, we're good, we have this, we're good. And this seems to be another exploitive pathway that if you don't do it completely, you might as well not do it at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So, just moving files to the cloud or even just moving applications to the cloud, that can happen regardless of talking and separate of having a discussion about a virtual desktop infrastructure. The difference in going to a VDI model is being able to centralize the control that you have and the security that you have in one place and having standardized desktops. Now all your control is in one area, in one set of systems versus distributed across multiple laptops, desktops, and iPads. So you're getting one desktop across the board. And that then accesses your cloud applications and files.
So could you go deeper into that when you implement a virtual desktop solution, what actually changes behind the scenes?
Yeah, so behind the scenes, you're more centralized. You say you have centralized management, as I just mentioned. You have the ability to allocate resources more effectively from a processor perspective, memory perspective, hard disk perspective. That all can be managed and allocated on the fly. Um, provisioning access, offboarding and onboarding new users becomes much easier in a more distributed model from a desktop perspective, from an infrastructure perspective. When you hire a new person, you've got to get a new computer. That new computer has to be set up. There's costs for both of those things versus in a BDI model, you're basically just adding the user to the system and they get their desktop. Right. So that's a big difference. Encryption is a big difference, having your transmissions encrypted, in transit and at rest. And then the redundancy that you have in a VDI model versus, again, a distributed architecture where if somebody's laptop gets broken or dropped, which in construction setting happens frequently, it takes time to get a new system provision and get it back into the hands of that worker versus VDI scenario, that just doesn't happen. The infrastructure is redundant by default in the data center, so you don't have that concern. If somebody drops or breaks something, then you hand them something. As long as they can get to the internet, it can get to its desktop, kind of a thing. So that significantly reduces the downtime for the user.
So it seems that it bridges the gap between the actual business activities and your infrastructure.
For sure. Yep.
And so you touched on it in your answer, but so what would happen if a laptop gets lost or stolen in a properly architected virtual desktop environment?
Yeah, so that's a key phrase, properly architected, because you still have to have security controls in place. But in a properly architected environment, you if you lose a laptop or a desktop dies or whatever, you have a newly provisioned one, and the only thing that that device has to be able to do is get to the internet. That's it, right? So instead of, a scenario where, again, you're in a distributed environment, you have, user profiles to create, you have local applications to put on the system, get everything pointed, get printers set up, all these different things. And again, that takes time to do. So, but in a VDI model, again, you're just handing somebody something that can get to the internet with a browser or a client that's loaded on there, and if they're able to access their desktop again. And so that space between failure or loss to getting my system back up and running is much, much shorter.
So I know we're talking something very specific in the strata of services that you offer. Just to reiterate, you do handle help, assistance, support with onboarding and offboarding in a cloud desktop model environment as a
That's
part
right.
of your overall services.
Yes. So, our overall services, we're essentially the IT department for the customer. We're providing the cloud services, we're providing the cybersecurity services. If they have to offboard or onboard a new user or a user that is being let go and they're transitioning away from, which happens a lot, very transient, a lot of field personnel are very transient. In those environments, they're submitting a ticket to us, and we're handling all the offboarding and onboarding.
There seems to be a misconception. I know I had it too because I asked you off recording here. The construction firms often use resource heavy applications. So when I think virtual, I'm thinking years ago where, there was cloud latency and performance issues. So how does performance compare to local installs?
Yeah, so in many cases, it's better because essentially, first of all, if we're going fully cloud, right, your applications, your construction related applications are running at with the vendor in their cloud already, right? And typically those are accessed via a browser. So from the virtual desktop, we're basically using, browser related applications, and we're using, say Office applications or Google Workspace applications, and those applications are running and using local processor. So we're really in a VDI environment. Your processing power is all on the back end on the cloud servers and not at the local desktop. We're only passing what's referred to as KVM data, so keyboard, video, and mouse. That's all that's being passed back and forth. So it's a very thin transmission, and that latency, doesn't really exist. And since the experience for the end user is very seamless. Now, it goes without saying, some of those applications that are running in the browser, right, they're graphically intensive. And so there are scenarios where it's important that the GPUs or graphical processing units on the back end are properly scaled to account for those needs. And, there are some more old school folks that, prefer to have that, have that local. That does happen from time to time, but in a properly architected environment, I know, again, that key phrase there, with the appropriate GPUs allocated, the experience should be fairly straightforward.
Now, is there any room for cybersecurity training to fit into a cloud desktop strategy?
For sure. So irrespective of your environment, whether you are a local environment, a completely distributed environment, or all of your systems are in a data center somewhere, you absolutely should have SAT or security awareness training. It bears repeating. Recent statistics have shown 9 out of 10 breaches start in email. And our experience in supporting our construction customers, that is absolutely the case. Just about, I would say almost 100% start in email. So it's very important to be training your end user community on how to watch, how to spot scams, how to watch for those kinds of things. And of course, your email tenant needs to be super secure as well. And that's something that we can help with.
That's what I was going to make sure that you included that that is something that it's not just one service, it is a strategy and you implement that entire strategy.
Yeah, it's um, and in prior discussions that we've done together, and even in some videos that I've done for customers, this cybersecurity, it's a evolving thing, right? So as technology evolves to help us thwart the bad actors, it also evolves to help them develop new strategies, right? And so where even 6 months ago, what we were calling a baseline security posture has modified since. Now we're talking about geofencing. We're talking about conditional access and things like that that are important to implement, and that's a whole additional layer above and beyond just your traditional security services.
Speaking of tradition, what other misconceptions do business owners have about virtual desktops?
Well, there certainly is a shift underway. In the past, there'd been trepidation about, surrendering control, being concerned about security. All my stuff's going to be in the cloud. And the reality is, it already is. I think the last hurdle was performance, right? But many of our customers are embracing the cloud now and understanding that security is actually better in the cloud, that there is a way to do this and not have any performance lag. They should surrender control, for lack of a better way of saying it, to the experts who can keep everything secure and tight versus having server sprawl in their environment and being concerned about where the next breach could happen or the next infrastructure failure could happen. So the mindset has shifted, and now rather than surrendering control and worrying about security, there's a better education and more understanding around it's the opposite. I'm actually gaining control going this direction, and I'm increasing my security posture.
Speaking of security, another shift is to cyber insurance. So, from a cyber insurance perspective, does this centralized cloud infrastructure help or does it add another layer of compliance struggles?
It certainly does not add a layer. It helps because, again, now you have centralized policy management. You have security standards in place around that infrastructure. You have transmissions are encrypted. Your data is encrypted at rest. These are all things and examples of typical questions when it comes to compliance standards and cyber insurance. The redundancy factor is a big deal, right? So how do I recover my data in the event of a failure becomes a much simpler question to answer. Same thing with disaster planning, recovery time objectives, things like that. That all helps with those kinds of questions.
It seems like that the more information you put out and you make a logical argument, education, that a lot of construction companies are maybe nodding their virtual heads right now. But when does a company know it's time to move from traditional infrastructure to cloud desktops? Is there a size factor or a growth factor, or are there incremental solutions along the way?
I don't know that there's a specific trigger per se. However, there are conditions that certainly make it much more of a, we need to go do this, right? And that would be, if you have multiple locations, a lot of construction firms have, I think you mentioned it early on, they have construction trailers. They have obviously field workers. So you have this hybrid environment where you have office workers versus remote workers. That those distributed personnel certainly is one condition that lends itself well to more of a cloud infrastructure and architecture. You have very complicated systems. You've got certain, you gotta, if your if your technology environment looks like the inside of a data center it may be time to consider moving it, right? Because that's really, you've just become your own data center with all the potential, all the concerns that you would have about having that in a local scenario versus, in the cloud in a secure area. So if the systems are complicated, that means they're support intensive. Cyber incidents can be a trigger or a condition to get it to the cloud. And if you have a capex intensive reset or refresh coming, that's a good time to consider it too. Servers aren't cheap; they're just getting more and more expensive. So to run some of these database applications required by construction firms, depending on your size, you're looking at a plus just for the hardware for a single server. So that's a good time to consider moving more to an OpEx type scenario with BDI or just standard hosting.
Right. Makes sense. If a construction owner said, what's the real business impact in addition to this security, which is sort of innocuous until you get bit with it, then you understand it completely. What's the real business impact of getting this right? What would you tell them?
Right up front, beyond security, as you said, you have a reduced, you have more uptime, right? Reduced downtime factor, where again, with the infrastructure is redundant as it is, right? So you would never be in a scenario where your systems are down because they're redundant, right? Getting personnel onboarded and offboarded are at a much faster pace, which we talked about earlier. That's a real business impact. What does it take? It's not uncommon for me to walk into a potential new construction customer, and here it takes us weeks to get and that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but about 5 to 7 days to get a person, up and running, and that's if they have hardware on the shelf, right? Versus putting in a ticket and saying, I have a new customer, here's their name, et cetera, and we basically set up a new user on the system, and boom, they have their desktop. So that's not inconsequential, that business impact. Having OpEx versus CapEx, there can be some debate around that, but having to every 3 to 5 years, we'll say, be staring at a complete infrastructure refresh versus here's your monthly fee to operate your business. Uh, Coming up with $50,000 project, to refresh a small technical environment is no small number. Being able to move to more of an OpEx model where it's predictable is usually favorable for most customers. And then I think, you know, especially if you're growing, right, being able to scale that environment faster without having yet another capex hit you versus, hey, okay, we've got three, we've grown by 5 users, so we're going to add a little bit of memory and disk space and GPU for those 5 users, and it's done by submission of a ticket rather than having to procure a new system, get it all set up, and so forth. So obviously, cloud infrastructure is vastly more scalable and much quicker to do so when you go to the cloud versus being local. And then I think that you can't overlook the intensive nature of having to support a local environment, being worried about hey, is my data room secure? Is it cool enough? Do I have redundant power supplies? Oh, this server's on the fritz, and 10 of my people can't do their job. Having not having to worry about that, but having less stress around that, I don't think that can be overlooked either.
No, it sounds like there's a lot of the old adages of time is money arguments there, just in different forms, with wrapped in different technological language. But I think that any business owner could understand that easily. I have a bonus for you. I recently got an email. Speaking of phishing emails, we'll call this a phishing email alert. And had I been a younger salesperson, I probably would have clicked on it because it looked like a matter of fact, I think the company's name was like Sterling Group, and they wanted to have, my core services. They put in the email some projects that I had worked on, some companies. They're like, oh, I liked what you did with Coca-Cola or this and that. And attached is, an SOW or something. But when I saw attached, I was like, first of all, this doesn't happen. You have to work for every contact, close the deal, things like that. So it was like this gifted email. And I thought I was like, I just hit the button because it was so sophisticated that to the untrained eye, and I just wanted to bring that up because we talked about before the old emails of like, I am deaf handicapped. You have to wire me money, and then to this, fast forward to this, it just sort of underscores the sophistication that keeps going, uh, with this. And I guess my question is, have you seen any other new ones or have any new, stories of exfiltration or something that's new on your end?
Yeah, so the biggest weakness, of any organization is the end users, right? And so we touched on security awareness training. It is so critical. You have that for your organization, and that it's mandated that the users watch it, because even we very recently had a customer who had you know all of well had the many of the security controls in place, not all of them, but many of the security controls in place that we provide. But still, a user responsible for accounts payable clicked on an email that was very targeted. They knew everything about the organization. They knew who the owners were. They knew their email addresses. They knew some of the vendors that they use. And so it was a very sophisticated, well architected email that they sent to that user. And she clicked on something to log into what she thought was one of the systems that they use. And it was a fake login screen. So they captured her credentials. And in doing that, they were able to send an email, actually put rules in place in the tenant to divert emails. And then, sent another email. I don't remember the number. I think it was $35,000 sticks in my head, which was not an atypical, payment to this particular vendor. And, they were able to catch it. And one of the reasons they were able to catch it was because they did something that I suggested to them, and which I send videos to my customers, suggesting things like this. But they put it in place, that they had to have out of band authentication, meaning that it's not electronic. I can't send you an email that says, yes, go ahead and pay it. You have to talk to me verbally, right? You have to get up out of your desk, walk into my office, and have me sign something that says I'm authorizing this payment, over a certain amount, kind of a thing. That they were able to catch it in that way. It is it's vital. And I mentioned earlier, I think in this discussion, about having geofencing in place, having conditional access in place. Those are things that you have to take. That's the next step in security to try to batten down the hatches, because if they AI is available to all now, not just for us to figure out how to do some research for something that you're writing or posting, but it's available to the bad guys too, to figure out ways to infiltrate companies. So that awareness training is critical.
Education is the key. Your experience is the key. Whenever you get on a discovery call with you, you seem to not just be selling packages. You seem to really try to understand the nuances of the business, because when we say construction, there's a lot of different areas of construction. There's installs, there's general contractors, there's engineering firms, there's architectural firms. So each discussion will sort of touch on everything, I guess, as the discussion goes. But you seem to have a priority set from your experience dealing in each industry. Do I have that right?
Yeah, we we take more of everything's tailored approach, right? No, there is not a one size fits all. Now there are specific solutions that solve specific problems, but every customer is unique in their needs, and so we don't take this canned approach where, okay, here it all is, and here's how we solve this problem. We listen, understand what's going on. I have this phrase, we love you as you are, kind of a thing, before we start. It would be irresponsible to say, here's how you fix your problem, without truly understanding, how you're operating today, what your workflows are, where the pain points are, where the constrictions come into play. So we try to tailor those solutions specifically for the customers to meet their needs.
Perfect. Well, we're coming up on time. I just wanted to thank you for these great informational just insights to sort of bridge that gap between what's available technology wise, but yet understanding the real world solutions and challenges. So, as always, I appreciate your time.
It's great being with you, Mark. Thanks for having me.